Today we're going to welcome Mary C. Trachsel, who grew up on a farm in Bremer County, Iowa. She earned a BA in English from the University of Iowa, and after graduate studies at Penn State and the University of Texas, she returned to the University of Iowa as a member of the Rhetoric faculty in 1989. Her interest in human-animal relationships is part of a broader study of environmental rhetoric, including rhetorics of interspecies communication. When I think back 100 years ago to what Iowa was like, animals were a very dominant part in our lives, especially if you were living on a farm or in a rural environment. We have such a monoculture now, we don't really have a sensitivity to the fact that these people got up at the crack of dawn to tend to their horses, to brush them, to feed them, to care for them, just so they could power their farm machinery and get their work done. And that farm was also full of a diversity of animals, from cows to sheep to pigs to chickens, geese, goats, probably a barnyard cat or two. All kinds of animals were part of life in Iowa. Now we've distilled our lives down to our pet cat or our pet dog. Maybe some of you are wealthy enough to maintain a horse at a stable, but most of us are sort of disconnected from animals in our life. I think it's important that we hear what she has to say today, because we need to raise our awareness about what's going on out in the landscape of Iowa with animals, or even here in our own town with research and things like that. Can you please join me in welcoming Mary today? Thank you.
Hi, it's really nice to be here today. This is, the Historical Society is a resource that I'm just discovering, and I have a lot more work to do here in terms of, just finding out how many pigs and how many cows and how many mules were in this state at various times, because this certainly is a place that humans share with other animals in the past and at present, though in very, very different forms. This is also a project that is a part of a much bigger project. I'm interested in our responsibilities to raise environmental consciousness. So even though I teach rhetoric, I think that having my students become more aware of the world around them, including the natural world, is a responsibility that at this point in our history, I think all of us have. And I think that environmental awareness really has to happen in place. So that made me interested in the history of human-animal relationships in this place where I teach, the University of Iowa campus. So in trying to find an illustration for my opening slide, I came across this. It's actually the second part of a cartoon sequence that was drawn by a University of Iowa student and published in the student annual for, I believe it was 1872, and I need to look into that. And you'll notice that there is a couple. In the preceding cartoon, there was a person with binoculars looking at the couple. And here, or I guess the person was using this to look at the couple. And the person goes away temporarily and comes, and the cow in his absence is looking at this couple as they're having a little tryst, presumably on campus. And you'll notice that there is a fence between the people and their pathway and the cow. In all of the old pictures of campus, one of the things that I'm aware of is that the wild and the domestic space there's a lot of gray area. And the fence was something that was erected around the perimeter of the Pentacrest in 1855. And it was primarily to keep pigs and other livestock off of campus. So my interest actually in this place developed out of a sighting, and I do not think I'm imagining this. But I saw in the Old Capitol Museum a picture of the University of Iowa campus very, very early in its history, and there were sheep on the campus. I know I saw that, and I have not been able to track it down. But there was a building on campus at one time that was called the Sheep Shed. And I don't know if that was because it actually housed sheep or had been used for that purpose and remained on campus after Some of the campus buildings were made. But clearly there was just a lot of coming and going between humans and animals on the campus. So my study is, I call this a natural history, and I also think of it as a sociobiological history. I'm very much influenced by the biologist Edward O. Wilson, who is credited with bringing the term biodiversity into our vocabulary. And Wilson looks at behavior as genetically transmitted, as a biological function. And he became very, very controversial in academic circles for suggesting that this was true of humans as well as other animals. So I have used Wilson's notion of sociobiology, that is the social behavior of human beings and other animals, and I have coupled that with the notion of a biome, that is a location, a natural location where certain ecological connections exist in a very complicated and interdependent web. So that's how I'm looking at humans and animals in this particular place. So a sociobiological history takes into consideration human history, but also human connections with other animals. So it's not just human history, it's the history of the natural place, with humans as one kind of actor in that place. So this is our beautiful campus. This is, of course, the Pentacrest, and this is the season. So you might see something like this today if you go down to the Pentacrest. But I also want to think about this in a broader context, because there are very characteristic Midwestern human-animal relationships in the surrounding community. When I was a kid, I was always fascinated. I grew up in Iowa on a farm, and I was always fascinated by my mother telling me about early descriptions by pioneers in this part of the country, and they described the landscape as an ocean of grass. And I have always wished that I could see the ocean of grass. There are places in Kansas along the interstate where you can kind of get that experience where grass just stretches forever. But of course, Iowa is no longer grassland. I believe that Iowa is the state in the union that has been most changed of all the 50 states in its natural features. So because corn is such a lucrative product, agricultural product now, it's the grass that has taken over most of the land of Iowa. Corn is often interchanged with beans. Beans put nitrogen into the soil, which is something that corn needs to grow, so there's a kind of symbiotic relationship between those plants. I'll get to my personal story later. But we have what is now called a monoculture in Iowa, a corn culture. It's also called the heartland. Sometimes Iowa is described as the heart of the heartland because of its capacity as a food supplier for the globe. I also remember seeing a book on the shelf of my community library in Sumner, Iowa, and the title of the book was, "Will They Get It in Des Moines?" And I had just learned what Des Moines was, and I asked my mother what was the meaning of that book title, and she said, "Oh, it's like Iowans are the lowest common denominator, and if they get it in Des Moines, they'll get it anywhere." And this was a book about, I think, pitching a Hollywood film or something like that. And so this was the question in the producer's mind. So these are some of the social and natural conditions of the landscape here. It's also very, very much changed from the population, both animal and human, that frequented this place 100, 200 years ago. One of the saddest historical reports that I've encountered is about the passenger pigeons. And this was from John Muir, who grew up in Wisconsin. The Midwest is a flyway and has been a flyway forever. So we get migratory birds coming down between the two mountain ranges on either side. They go along the rivers. So we see a lot of migratory birds in this particular area. Passenger pigeons, which are now extinct, once were so prolific in this part of the country that they would darken the skies. Sort of like the penguins down in Antarctica, just, huge, huge flocks of these birds. And it wasn't very long before hunting eradicated, as well as habitat loss eradicated this population, and they're now extinct. So I want to talk a little bit about the characters who take part in this drama. And I have looked at some census figures, and you get a sense of how the Iowa population over time has grown fairly steadily, not dramatically, but fairly steadily. A finer grained look at population figures would show that the population actually dipped in the 70s and 80s in the wake of the farm debt crisis, so we had a lot of people leaving Iowa. But it recovered and has again begun to grow, but very slowly. We also have an aging population, and so this picture by Grant Wood seems as though it might be an appropriate picture for the Iowa population today, except that a minority is now living in the country, and the majority has moved to population centers like Iowa City, like Cedar Rapids, the Quad Cities, Des Moines, Sioux City, Council Bluffs. So the population has gradually left the land and gone to the urban centers. Iowa City, however, has an anomalous population, human population, because of the university. So while the Iowa population in general is aging steadily, the University of Iowa population is forever young. So since 1989, I have been coming to the same 18-year-old faces again and again and again. And the university and the Iowa City population is, of course, much, much younger and much more diverse in terms of cultural background than the rest of Iowa. So there are some dramatic cases of cultural diversity in Iowa. Postville comes to mind with the Jewish packing plant and some of the Latin American workers. Fairfield is another one with the Maharishi University, which attracts people from all over the globe. So you have some sort of anomalously diverse populations. And these are kind of news in Iowa, that there are these this kind of population diversity. Okay, so I am a character in this story. Not only am I a native Iowan, but my family has long, long ties to the university, as well as to the natural history of this place. So this is a picture. I'm sorry this is so dark. This is actually me and my father. I must have been about 4 years old. I think it was before I went to school. I grew up in northeast Iowa, not in the really, really pretty part, which is where the glaciers did not all come. So I'm just on the edge of that. Close enough that on weekends we could go to the woods and tromp through the woods and explore caves, limestone caves, collect watercress from the spring-fed streams, go through cow pastures where my father would sort of monitor the cows as we made, or the bull as we made our pass through it. So I have a kind of woodland experience of Iowa that isn't common to, we don't think of Iowa as a woodland place, but there is quite a bit of that up in that northeast corner. My parents were very, very influenced by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And my father, as a farmer, became very sensitive to just environmental issues like fertilizer, like tiling. And we were fortunate to have on our farm 3 little stretches of native prairie. And they are lowland, they're sloughs, so they're drainage parts of the property. And it's very, very common as grain prices have risen and it has become more and more common to do very intensive farming, that these lowland areas would get tiled. So drainage tiles would be put under the ground and this would become farmable land. And my father actually had plans to tile the sloughs, but fortunately Rachel Carson intervened, and his and my mother's ecological sensitivity was piqued, and they decided to leave the sloughs as they were. And I'm so glad that they have, because these are places where shooting stars, Johnny jump ups, you know, all of these native Avon, grandfather's whiskers, all of these old prairie flowers and grasses are still growing. And my brother, my older brother, who lives on the farm now, has a business collecting native prairie flower and grass seeds and marketing them through a nursery in Minnesota. So it's something that is really, really diminishing. And so even these little strips of prairies are kind of remarkable. So when my parents read Rachel Carson, their interest went not to animals but to plants. And they became very, very interested in botany. Both of them had a kind of informal education in botany. My mother's mother was a famous gardener in Hawkeye, Iowa. Yes, there is a town called Hawkeye, Iowa. And my father was raised in Missouri, and one of the workers on the farm, used to collect herbs for cooking and for medicinal purposes, and he learned a lot just informally through her. But after Rachel Carson, they began really studying in earnest, and one of the ways that they did that was to start taking botany classes here at the University of Iowa through the Saturday and evening extension courses. So through that, they not only learned a lot about botany, my father began collecting old botany books from used bookstores, and our walks became identification walks, where he would, you know, give us little lectures about the flowers we were finding. We also had people coming out to the farm, so it made the farm kind of a crossroads in Iowa. Okay, so my interest, however, was never so much in the plants, but in the animals. And in this picture, my father and I are looking at water striders, which, if you've ever seen them, they're those little long-legged, they look like daddy long legs, and they scoot across the top of the water. And when the sun shines on them, it makes a really interesting round foot pattern against the surface below the water. So I was always interested in animals, more in animals than plants. And in particular, because I lived on a hog farm, or a hog and other animal farm, which then became a hog farm and then became a crop farm. So I became interested in just how many pigs are there in Iowa. And I need to do more of this to find out, you know, just how populous this animal has been. In 1895, the Iowa Agricultural Statistics report that there were over 3 million pigs in Iowa. So more than there were people. And that seems to have always been the case. There were always more pigs than people in this place. And it's hard to track down exactly how many pigs there are in Iowa, because it's a kind of mobile population. So you get different figures. In 2012, at the end of the year, it was reported that there were 20.6 million pigs on hand. So presumably that means here on farms in Iowa. But many more had been marketed throughout the year. And this is the estimated production in pounds, which is astonishing. It's astonishing. Many hogs are started in Canada and then are brought down to Iowa for finishing before they go to market. So it is a very mobile population. There are just hogs moving through this state. One account that I read in a magazine said that the best place to see hogs in Iowa now is on the interstate. You see them with their nose pressed through the trucks as they're shipped from one place to another. This has also been a geographically shifting population. So in the 1880s through the 1890s, there was fairly even distribution across the state. But more recently, this has become concentrated in the west and northwest and certain other places throughout the state. But if you look at a map now, you see certain parts of the state are very, very dark. And then there are some counties which have, I think the lowest density was 1 pig per square mile. So, and I can't remember which counties those were, but so it's very uneven. So this population, not only has it increased, but it has geographically shifted. And then I'm also interested in another animal inhabitant. I am interested in cats not only because I was interested in Mary's description of what life used to be like with all these different animals. That was my childhood. But instead of a barn cat or two, we had 30 barn cats or two. And you know that in the rural areas of Iowa, there is a massive population of cats that is sort of looking for a home, looking for a fight, looking for sex. They are out there. It's a very dense population. And really, we don't know how many cats are out there. These, we'll call them cats at large. Some of them are feral, some of them are not. And I really got interested in Iowa's cat population when I read an account of Australia's feral cat situation. And it turns out that dingoes used to be, they were a game animal. People were encouraged to shoot them because they were perceived as a threat to the sheep and cattle herds. So in the absence of the dingoes, the rabbits took over. And so cats were actually brought on trains to the center of Australia to deal with the rabbit population. And so in the intervening years between then and now, the situation has shifted completely, and dingoes are a protected species, and the cats are this huge pest. And there are all kinds of recommended ways of dealing with the cat population. I became involved with this group called the Iowa Humane Alliance, and its mission was to establish a high-volume, low-cost spay and neuter clinic to deal with not just the cat population, but also dogs in Iowa. And their estimate is that in Cedar Rapids alone, there may be 20,000 feral cats. Cedar Rapids is kind of an unusual situation because in the aftermath of the flood, a lot of people left their neighborhoods. And several years ago, I haven't been down recently, so I don't know what it's like now, but several years ago when these houses were just standing there abandoned, they had been taken over by cats. So if you would look through the window, you'd see cats everywhere. And there was nothing stopping them from breeding, and cats can breed and increase their populations very, very fast. So This actually is a picture of one of those cats from Cedar Rapids taken a few years ago. And some people were at various places taking care of feral colonies, and that became a big controversy in Cedar Rapids. Should they be killed? Should they be neutered and released? Should they be neutered and euthanized? Or why would you neuter them and then euthanize them? But there were a lot of divergent ideas about what should be done with these cats. And they become a concern. Usually, animals that go feral tend to be classified by official agencies as disease threats. So they can be vectors of diseases, not just that can be transmitted to people like rabies, but also that spread within the cat population. So there's also concern about the interaction between cats and their prey, especially desirable prey such as songbirds and game birds. People don't seem to mind that they kill rats and mice and even chipmunks, but people get upset about the songbirds. And then the cats also are prey animals for larger wild animals. So they might be attracting to those larger prey predators. And then there are certainly complicated relationships between cats and their human keepers, both in the country and in town. So the situation today is that many animals in Iowa are housed away from view in what are called CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. And in my visits up to my hometown, I see more and more of these springing up in the very, very rural areas. And it is a cost-effective way of raising lots and lots of meat. And you saw the figure in poundage of how much meat this state produces. So it's because of this kind of feeding operation that we're able to have as many hogs in Iowa. And of course, these bring all kinds of environmental concerns as well as animal welfare concerns. What's the quality of life that these animals have in these kinds of operations? Can they fulfill their natural instinctive behavior patterns? So from 1978 through 2002, this population began shifting north and west as more and more hog confinement operations were established in that part of the state. So in 1987, still somewhat even distribution, but by 2002, it was radically different, radically changed. So not only is the animal population concentrating, but the human population, of course, is concentrating into urban centers, and the result is something like this. This is the Blank Park Zoo, which is Iowa's premier zoo. It's in Des Moines. And in, I believe it was 2006, the zoo inaugurated a farm animal exhibit because so many Iowa children had no contact with Iowa farm animals. So visiting a farm animal, here these kids are petting a young pig. Visiting a farm animal has, in this agricultural state, become one of Iowa's wildest adventures. So I'm sure they have. I haven't seen this exhibit. Has anybody seen this? I presume they have goats. Goats are always a popular exhibit at this kind of a place. But I thought it was interesting that the population was now so urbanized that this had become a really kind of foreign experience. Okay, so getting back to campus, which is embedded in this larger geographical and social and agricultural context is the University of Iowa, and a biologist would say that this is a riparian biome, and I love that phrase, so that's why I put it in here. It just means a habitat around a river. So there are desert biomes, and there are marshland biomes, and mountainous biomes, and tundra biomes, and ours is a riparian biome. And I mentioned before the rivers that cut through the Midwest being flyways for migratory birds who will stop and rest at ponds and rivers along the way as they migrate back and forth from north to south. And of course, we in Iowa City know that lately this has become an environmental concern, the Iowa River. The Iowa River is, in 2007, was designated one of the most endangered habitats, river habitats in the country. And the reason for that was pollution from agricultural runoff, seepage, particularly from those large concentrated feeding operations, as well as the fertilizers that are put on increasingly intensified crop farming operations. So we have both fertilizers and animal excrement. You can imagine in places like that hog CAFO that I showed you that the sewage problem is tantamount to that of a city. So in city areas, we have sewage regulations for dealing with that, and we do not have those same kinds of regulations in place for these animal feeding operations. So that's one of the reasons for the water quality problems that we have in the state of Iowa. I was here in 1993 when it rained and it rained and it rained, and we had the first dramatic Iowa City flood. And at the time, it was hailed as a real anomalous situation, and I remember it being described as the 500-year flood. And we all thought, phew, we're over with it. We got that out of the way, and now we don't have to worry about that for another 500 years. But in fact, 15 years later, we had an even worse flood, which caused the relocation of Hancher and the relocation of the arts students. So the arts campus took it pretty hard. And there are a number of reasons why our rivers are flooding. And one of them has to do with that tiling of the drainage areas in the agricultural areas of the state, so that there is no longer this sort of spongy, absorbent part of the Iowa landscape that absorbs some of this moisture, this rainwater or snow melt, before it gets to the rivers. So you can also imagine what all of the concrete that we have covered much of the developed areas of Iowa, the urban areas. So this is another contributing factor. Not only have we lost the marshland, but we have paved over some of the other absorbent parts of our landscape. So the rivers take it, and if you make arrangements so that the water flow is taken care of at this part of the river, you know that it's going to be an even bigger problem further down the river. So it's not just an Iowa problem, it's a problem throughout the Mississippi Valley and the Missouri Valley, so both sides of our state. This is a picture of campus in 1900. This is spring 1900, and this was 45 years after the ordinance was passed to erect the fence around the Pentacrest. And you see that in this picture, at least, there don't seem to be any animals roaming at large. I discovered in reading the student paper, the student newspaper, so this would have been the predecessor to, or one of the many predecessors to the Daily Iowan. And this really drove home to me that students are forever young. There were often reports of interactions between students and animals. For a while, the university football team had a bear mascot named Birch, and Birch was taken along to the games, and sometimes there would be reports that the opposing team had baited the bear and that the bear was threatening the opposing teammates until the Iowa boys intervened and called the bear off. The bear met a sad ending. It was drowned in the Iowa River, and I believe bears can swim, so I'm not sure what the circumstances were, but there seems to have been a kind of boys will be boys kind of attitude about the treatment of this bear. There were also a lot of stories about a billy goat that roamed around campus. There were stories of people in the liberal arts having to chase chickens away, and that the law students were often bringing this goat into classrooms as a prank, and that there seems to have been rivalry between the medical students and the law students, and the medical students would try to snatch the goat, and there were sort of ha-ha stories about how Billy the goat wouldn't go with the medical students because he had heard stories about how they treated stray dogs. So more about that in a minute. In the 1920s, the University of Iowa Natural History Museum really began to accumulate its collection. And there were stories about the billy goat that was brought to the University of Iowa campus that was shot and killed and collected in a hunting expedition to collect specimens for the museum. And so the Natural History Museum has been a site for taxidermy and natural history education. And again, a little bit of my personal history. I was born with, without a fully formed right hip socket. And this is like a congenital called dysplasia. Large dogs have this problem. So my brother and I inherited this condition, and we became research subjects for Dr. Ponsetti, who is known for clubfoot treatments, but also did a non-surgical treatment of hips in infants. So coming to Iowa City and browsing around the campus, visiting the Natural History Museum was part of my childhood experience. And this was such a, an exciting thing to do, to come and see these taxidermied animals. So I'm very grateful, though I don't think I could ever be a taxidermist myself. I'm very grateful that the university had this kind of collection. Another way in which humans and animals interact on campus today is in animal experimentation. So I just told you that I was a research subject, and other animals serve in that position as well. The early days of the university, as I mentioned, the medical students had a reputation of being very hard on stray dogs because they would use them for dissection. So evidently they were responsible for getting their own dissection subjects. And I was very interested to know that and this is from Irving Weber's History of Iowa, that in the very early days of the medical school, the school was closed down for a number of years because some students and an instructor had been convicted of grave robbing in a nearby graveyard for the purpose of obtaining dissection specimens. But some really interesting things are happening today that I wasn't aware of until I started looking into this. University of Iowa has, has a genetic, what do you call it? They create new animals. So among the new animals that they create are, and this is particularly for cystic fibrosis research. So they have genetically created animals that are particularly good for this kind of research, and they have something with their trachea. There's something about the trachea. So, but they also make a certain kind of pig that is used in tracheal transplant surgery. So from hogs overrunning the campus to hogs being created in Iowa laboratories, it's quite a ride. Then I want to just tell a little story about something that happened in the 1990s. And this was the nursing school feral cat controversy. I've already mentioned that feral cats are just ubiquitous in Iowa, and some of them began taking up residence near the nursing building, toward the rear of the nursing building, and people began feeding them. People who worked in the building began feeding them, and eventually this came to the attention of the dean, who was concerned about the health threat of these cats being so close to the door, as well as the possibility that these cats would attract other predators and that they were unsanitary. I later learned through investigating, through people who had actually taken part in this, this story, that another concern was that workers were spending too much time looking out the window at these cats, especially after they had kittens. So, and that people, that the office workers weren't spending their time working, that these cats were too much of a distraction. But these are some of the shelters and the feeding bowls that were arranged. And this actually, there was a huge furor that involved the Humane Society, the Johnson County Humane Society, and the people in the building and the deans, and I believe even the president weighed in on this. And for a long time there were talks, and people were concerned that these cats were going to be euthanized, or that. So eventually they were allowed to stay here for a while, but eventually the dean said they got to go, and they brought in people to trap them. And all but 2 were trapped, and some of them were housed, continue to be housed, are still feral, but are living in someone's house, if you can believe that. Just another view of the cats that those people might have had through their windows. These look like feral cats to me. You can see how bushy their coats are. They're used to living outside. Cats will come where they're fed. Something else that is changing in the broader context, and I'm curious to know if this ever changes in the on-site campus context, and that is, I'm sorry that you can't see these very well. This is a bear that was sighted up in northeast Iowa. This was very close to where my family's farm is. And down here is a moose. So increasingly, we are getting some large predators and some large prey animals that had virtually been extinguished. And I don't know if this is because the human population is becoming less and less dense in rural parts of Iowa. I'm not sure exactly what the reason is, but there have been increased sightings of bears, moose, elk, cougars. I think even near Iowa City here we've had cougar sightings, and bobcats. And I was surprised to know that bobcats have been killed by the hundreds in this state, and that over a period of I think less than 10 years, the hunting season for bobcats in Iowa has increased from 19 days to 91 days, that there is no longer a quota and that last year, well over 500 bobcats were shot in the state of Iowa. I was astonished to know that. I think they're primarily in southern Iowa counties. So on campus, despite the fact that there are ordinances against domestic animals, pets on campus, there are certain ways in which domestic animals function officially on campus. And this is the University of Iowa Hospital's therapy animal program. So people with therapy dogs come and visit patients, and it is a demonstrated success in raising spirits and sometimes in even improving physical health. Recently, the University of Iowa student organization, PAWS, has begun bringing therapy dogs to campus during finals week so that students can take a break. So in some very restricted ways, animals are allowed on campus. But several years ago, the ruling against animals on campus buildings, unless they're research animals or unless they're the squirrels and rabbits and ducks and things that are sort of scenic additions to our campus. I had a friend who, in the economics department, who used to keep a Yorkshire Terrier in her handbag, her very large handbag. And there was an ongoing battle between the dean and this professor about whether or not she was allowed to bring her dog onto the university campus and into the buildings. And it was, a long, ongoing battle. But at the time that this was going on, the dean was keeping frogs in her office. So, which she said, maybe that's not legal either. So there is an official injunction against animals on campus, but it's not really, like I have occasionally, I think illegally, walked my dogs across campus. And one of the things that you see is that students are attracted to those dogs like magnet. And many of them say, I'm so lonesome for my dog at home. I wish I had my dog here. So I am really interested in how the university campus has gone from this place where sheep safely grazed to a place where there's legislation against the presence of animals, except in these very restricted situations. And then feral animals in Iowa. These are domestic animals that have gone stray, and I've already talked about the cats. This is another, I love this cat. He's an old Tom. This is also from one of the flooded houses in Cedar Rapids. But feral hogs are an increasing problem, not just in Iowa, but in other places across the country. And they now have an open hunting season on feral hogs. And these come from various places. With as many hogs as we have in Iowa and traveling through Iowa, you can guess that some are going to escape and some are going to elude capture. And like cats, hogs go feral fairly fast. It doesn't take long for them to adapt and begin physically adapting. They get bristlier hair, they get leaner. So and their snouts start protruding for better reaching and rooting. And they travel along rivers. So one of the things that we may see on campus is, feral hogs coming up, and I think that would be an exciting development. Some of the Department of Agriculture reports of these are pretty interesting. The report started making it into the animal industry news in 2008. And there was a report of a wild boar commingling, that was the word that was used, commingling with a commercial operation south of Thurman, Iowa. And the DNR investigated this and looked into, what was happening, and I think some of these some of the feral hogs with the boar were thought to have gone into Missouri. And this report said that they were not, that Iowa did not seek their return. So along with feral cats, we can expect to see more feral hogs. And I wanted to just conclude with this timely announcement from the Iowa Humane Alliance having to do with the Feral Freedom Fest, which is taking place on October 19th. And this is about making affordable spay and neuter opportunities available, low cost. They now have a transport van, so they'll actually pick up animals. And they also have trapping materials that people can borrow. So if you or anybody you know is interested in the feral cat situation, there is ways to learn about trap, neuter, release operations, as well as opportunities to get animals spayed and neutered very cheaply by a registered veterinarian. So I thank you for your attention, and I would be very interested in any, historical information that you might have about animals either in the wild or, throughout Iowa or on the Iowa campus, because this is really a project that's in progress for me. So thank you very much. And I think there's time for questions. Hi.
Yeah, this was all fascinating stuff and very useful. You didn't mention deer. They're, of course, a huge topic, and I'm sure you have thoughts on them.
Certainly, deer are prevalent throughout the state, and the population right now is under stress from a disease, a wasting disease. And so this is, in the surrounding area. I know that on campus, especially the golf course has been a site where they've been concerned about deer. And I think that one of the reasons that we're seeing some of these large predators, bear and cougar and bobcats, is because of the dense deer population.
Don't you think we could also have predators? Don't you think we could also have predators because they've been removed from their other natural habitats?
Yes, certainly. That they're probably following the rivers and following what wild spaces and crossing fields. So, yeah, there's not really barriers to keep them out of farmland. So I'm sure that that's part of it. As the human population increases in this country, the population of other animals gets squeezed and, seeks habitat wherever it can find it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, this was all great. So I have a question because you started talking about the university campus as a biome, as something unique. And, we can see that we're in part of this state, which has this diminishing biodiversity and the kind of large natural history of the state. And we can compare that with urban areas and like the flooded urban areas in Cedar Rapids and what happens there. But what seems unique about the university campus in part has to do with the kind of landscaping and mix of wooded areas and its position along the river. And also, as you were indicating, the introduction of all these other species in the animal laboratories and such. So I guess I'm sort of curious how far you're going to push this notion of the university as a distinct biome that's along the riverbed, that's part of what's happened to the state of Iowa, but is also unique from, say, urban areas and rural areas. It's its own kind of new kind of biome.
Well, I think humans have been transforming biomes everywhere. And I think there is a particular type of transformation that a university is with things like research animals that you don't have in other places. So if you look at a place in terms of its human and non-human inhabitants, and you could also include plants. I haven't done that, but you could also do that. I think that, who knows historically, down the line, what's going to happen with those research animals. We did have the ALF invasion in, I can't remember the date. But if you remember the coverage of that incident, they reported that they had released those animals. So now we have research animals that are commingling with the wild population. So I think that, you know, whether you look at it as a completely constructed human environment or as a human environment that exists within a natural, you know, what we think of as natural, because we tend to make distinctions between our environment and the natural world. But I want to look at us as a part, and the things we do as a part of the natural world. So I guess I'm ready to push it as far as I can. And I think it's important for students, because I think that my students are increasingly detached from the natural environment and increasingly attached to a virtual environment. So, you know, they might be looking at animal pictures on their screen, but they're not really coming into contact with them. So, as an educational environment, I think it's important to look at that and to think about the extent to which, just as denizens of the natural world, we have a responsibility to educate students about the natural world. So I guess, you know, I'm ready to go as far as it'll go.
Yeah, I think we tend to forget that at the beginning of the 20th century, most farms in Iowa were diversified farms. And so a family had maybe 3 milk cows, 6 pigs, 4 horses, some sheep, et cetera, et cetera. And every member of the family spent a good part of every day outdoors looking after the animals, as well as gardening and bringing up the cows. And that's all changed. Today, I don't know of a diversified farm anymore. Farmers either raise
A hobby farm maybe would be.
maybe, or an occasional small, what do you call it? Farm that raises vegetables.
Specialty farm?
Specialty farm
Mm,
raising
organic
vegetables.
farm or-
Organic farm. But most farms now raise property line to property line corn or soybeans year after year. And like you said, you don't see hogs or sheep outdoors anymore, or chickens or turkeys. They're all confined in buildings.
Right.
And another thing I ran across when I was a kid, I got a map from the state which showed the area where I grew up in Lee County, southeastern Iowa. It had a little square for every farmhouse. And I was astounded that there was at least one, and often 2 or sometimes even 3 farmhouses on every 1 mile of road. And when I was growing up, about a third of those were gone, and more than 50% of the remaining ones were abandoned.
That's the way it is in my home county.
So it means that back at the beginning of the 20th century, there were lots of farmers outdoors, and they probably all had guns, and they shot wild animals to eat or just because they thought they were vermin. That's all changed. There's very few farmers anymore, and they don't spend much time outdoors. And if they do, they're sitting inside an air-conditioned
huge
cab,
cabs, yeah.
looking at their GPS computer. They don't spend any time outdoors.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the reasons I am so interested in this is because I'm old enough that I have seen, I've become a historical relic. I have seen firsthand. I was at the end of those family farms, and I remember our farm had hogs, we had beef cattle, we had a milk cow, we had chickens, and we had lots and lots of cats, a dog, and that's just how we grew up.
in addition to that, up until 1950, we also had on our farm foxes, groundhogs.
Badgers.
I've never seen a badger in
We
my
had a
life.
badger.
But mink, weasel, muskrats,
Beavers.
and rabbits,
Beavers.
We didn't have beavers, or we weren't any big enough water bodies nearby. But we shot the rabbits to eat, and my brother trapped all the other animals to sell for furs. But those are gone now. They are absolutely extinct. You cannot find a mink, a weasel, a muskrat anywhere in that area. They're just totally wiped
Songbirds,
out.
too. The population of songbirds has
Yes.
dramatically changed. I remember seeing bobolinks everywhere, and you don't see bobolinks anymore. I haven't seen one for years.
Or meadowlarks.
Meadowlarks. Yeah.
They require a prairie biome
Yeah,
for their nesting.
Right.
Is there a feral dog population? I never heard of feral hogs. Is there a feral dog population?
Is there a feral dog population? I think there is. I think it's probably not as big as the feral cat population because they're bigger animals and they probably aren't as good hunters as cats are. But I know that when I was a kid, there used to be packs of dogs that would roam through the countryside. And I remember we never would go out and get a dog. We just wait until a dog came. So if we lost a dog, it would be a matter of time before word would spread that there's an opening at the Brayton farm and we'd have another dog. So there are, and dogs I think don't go as exclusively feral as early as cats do in the process of being uncared for by humans. So, I think dogs, my brother, who still lives on the farm, he acquired his dog, she just showed up and, so yes, there is a feral population, but it's not as big as the cats, I'm sure.
Throughout the, from say 1920 through the end of the 20th century, only 2 of our farm dogs were ever purchased. All the others just showed up and
Yeah.
adopted us.
And sometimes
Including a
they show up in
Dalmatian.
pairs, and 2 at a time.
We had a big dog, we had a Dalmatian, we had one that was wavy, brown-haired. I can't remember all the dogs, but
I think there are regional differences in farm dogs. The dogs in my part of the country they had a lot of collie and shepherd in them, and other places it's more lab. And
Would you talk about birding on campus? Is there an organized effort to put a census out or determine what we have left?
one of my Rhetoric students actually started the Student Bird Watching Club. And she has graduated, and I don't know if that club has continued, but it's certainly worth looking into. I don't know that any of the departments, any of the academic units does anything with that, but this was a student organization, so it was an extracurricular thing. And I know that they were active enough that they got various businesses in town to donate binoculars, and so they were and they would hook up with some regional bird watching groups, and I don't know if they did the Christmas census or that sort of thing, but there has been. I can't say that it's going on right now, but are you a birder? No. Certainly ducks are our favorite birds on campus.
We have some birders here, but we won't ask them. You've presented so many excellent ideas today and given us a lot of provocative thoughts and increased our awareness, and I'm very thankful for that. And there's 2 things that I'm going to take away. One is just that the human interaction is a very sensory experience. It's something that turns on hormones inside of us that we don't even know about sometimes. And so I feel like future generations are going to be deprived of that animal-human bond that I think is actually essential to our
And
existence.
current generations
Yes.
are deprived.
And
yeah.
the second thing, just to comment on your first thing about will they get it in Des Moines? Because the largest concern I have about Iowa is really about these CAFOs and our water quality, and the fact that our governmental leaders seem to be aligned with the agricultural businesses, and so they don't get it in Des Moines. and neither will they let the local people control the outcome of these things. And so I think that lectures like you gave today are exceedingly important, and I hope people see this broadcast later so that they can increase their understanding and not just have this be disguised and hidden away like you suggested with these large animal confinement operations. And so, again, thank you very much for coming here today, Mary. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device. Iowa City in Focus brings the people, places, and activities of Iowa City into clear view. This month's episode is all about the environment. Host Mary Bryant talks with Jen Jordan, recycling coordinator for the City of Iowa City. Also featured is the new medication disposal receptacle at the Iowa City Police Station. And you'll get to hear about recycling project assistant Jane Wilch's work on food waste reduction. For more information about this and other programs, visit citychannel4.com.